So today we're going to be talking about, some mistakes that are made early in the seasons, what we have to avoid, how we can fix it. Nate, we're going to lead off with you. And what is a mistake that you want to avoid at all costs?
Something I see people do way too early in the season is trade away your first round pick. And I mean, so this year, within the first 4 weeks of the season, trading away your 2024 first. It's almost always a bad idea unless within the first couple of weeks, God forbid, your RB1 goes out there who you're relying on to really carry your team and goes out there and tears his ACL first couple of weeks. And then you really have to pivot and you're just kind of screwed anyway. So you got to pay up. But otherwise, I like to hold on to my upcoming first round pick. If it's a future first round pick, like a 2025, 2026, I don't mind that. I don't love the idea that you always have more time to go back and get your picks because they're just harder to acquire the more time it passes. Mm-hmm. But it's true, you do have time to go back and acquire those picks. If this trade doesn't work out for you with the first round pick, you're not going into the 2024 draft, the next one, with nothing. So I want a first round pick in this upcoming draft. I don't want to trade it away too quickly. Draft picks become more valuable later. So when teams are already rebuilding, you've already kind of had the split after like week 7, week 8, where you have some of the league looking towards next year already. You have the other part of the league. They know they're contenders. They're making that playoff push. That's when you want to trade your first round pick if you're going to trade your first round pick, because it's going to have more value at that point because players are already looking towards next season. They're valuing that first round pick because that's how their timeline is. While they don't care about the current production, it's actually in some leagues, if you go by potential points, it's negatively affecting them. So yeah, of course I'll move off of, Derrick Henry for your late 2024 first, and you get to pick up a stud running back to add to your competitive team. That's where you want to make that deal a little bit later in the year when you have more value and you can kind of use that as your, as an advantage. It's also better to have it as your wild card up your sleeve. You don't want to give it away too early and then something happened and you're just stuck at that point. You don't have anything else to give. You are hopefully going into the season with depth on your team. You need that depth. You should go through that depth before trading away your first round pick, hopefully, if you have strong depth. That way, that first round pick is your last asset. You don't want to just be throwing them around, getting rid of them, unless you are really one of the top teams, and this is the pick that is going to get you to the top. So I like to hold on to those guys. If you need to trade away draft capital early in the season, like I said, a future first isn't the worst thing. I would prefer to trade like a second round pick, a third round pick. Those are a little bit easier to get back than first round picks.
Yeah, and I would even say with Nate's, like if you trade a first early for like a Derrick Henry, that's a lot of time left for him to play out the whole season. I'd rather keep it and hold on and then get somebody a little bit later. That way I can maybe avoid injury at that point. I mean, I understand you got to score points, but I still think you got to kind of play the long game as well, especially if you're a competing team and you're going to make the playoffs.
Chev, what is a mistake that you like to avoid and you want to tell people to avoid early in the Dynasty season?
My mistake is just giving up too early on your team. So I've seen a lot of times where maybe my team starts off 0-2 or 0-3. Sometimes it's just bad luck. Sometimes you just go up against the gauntlet and you play the 3 best teams or the 3 highest scoring teams of the week, and you just really get screwed. I think you just have to be patient. You just cannot panic early on. There's so many other games throughout the season. I see it too many times where a team starts off 0-3 and 0-4, and it's actually a good team, and then they just try to start selling players away when they actually have a chance to compete once the season keeps going. So sometimes you just face the gauntlet. You face off against teams that just score more points. I just think you have to be patient. You cannot panic. You have to continue to fight the fight. We didn't wait 15 weeks for the NFL season to start just to give up 3 weeks into the season. Mm-hmm. Don't give up. You have a chance still. One thing I like to do too, I ask advice to people around me. I mean, reach out to somebody, ask them some opinions. Do you think this team is good enough to continue going on, or should I try to maybe think about moving some pieces? Get an outside perspective. Obviously, don't be asking somebody in your league what you should be doing. If it's a competitive team, they're going to tell you to sell away if they think you're an asset or if you think you're a competitor against them.
That's why we got the Patreon.
Exactly. You have that outside source to get their opinions, and we have 150 people to help you out and do that. I think you just got to start thinking clearly too. Get it out of your brain that you're losing and you're in big trouble now. Think clearly. And then also don't just trade for players that produce early. Don't trade for those guys that have produced early. We've seen players that show off the first 3 weeks of the season, like a Will Fuller, and then they end up getting hurt or busting out really quickly. You want to find those guys that have already put that on paper and that have shown, maybe DJ Moore didn't have the best start maybe a few seasons ago, but we've known he's a 1,000-yard receiver, somebody that finds a way to get the job done. Mike Evans has started slow in a few seasons, and he always ends up producing later on at the end of the season. So watch out for trading for players that just produce super early. It could be Paris Campbell this year. He could be a guy that starts off hot. That is not a guy I'm really looking to trade for. I'm looking to trade him away to somebody like that. So that's what I would say are some of the mistakes that I see and ones that I'm hopefully trying to avoid.
Sometimes people ask me, oh, I'm like 0-2, whatever, what should I do? And I'm like, set your lineup. And they don't like that advice, but it's true because people panic way too early, and it's the instant gratification society that we have as a whole right now. It's insanity to me to just either give up or go all in way too early. Sometimes the best thing to do is just do what you have to do. And don't they always say, Chev, like early in the season, don't defenses typically have a leg up on the offenses? Like you've heard that every year from commentators. And I'm going to tell you to not ignore waiver wire opportunities. But Mike, it's Dynasty. Everyone's roster is loaded. Nah, not necessarily true. I could show you some of my rosters that are still an ongoing work in progress, but nobody wants to trade with me. It's terrible. I have 2 examples, okay? And this was me saying, I don't need that guy. I'm set. One is Robert Tonyan. The other is James Robinson. Now, these guys didn't turn out to be viable long-term fantasy assets, but they could have helped me win games. They could have been trade pieces for other players. I should have taken a shot, and I didn't. And I kicked myself in the rear end for not doing it. Another guy who was a really good waiver wire opportunity, J.D. McKissick. J.D. McKissick was a really good PPR receiving back for a while, and I paid fab dollars for him. I was able to start him in a flex spot. And again, not saying that these guys that you get off the waiver wire are going to necessarily be studs, but there are times where you could find some good value on there. You have to be active. This could have propelled me to a championship. It could have given me good trade pieces, or just anything. So these are just 2 examples that I regret. I'm sure there's many more that I've forgotten about since then. How to avoid this? Keep your eyes and ears open. Follow 32 beat writers on Twitter or X, whatever it is. Those guys are really up to date with what's going on. There's going to be trusted sources. And you know what? Talk to fans of that team because they have the inside pulse. Like, I'll tell you straight up, I know a lot of Steelers fans, and they're like, Jaylen Warren is not taking Najee Harris's job. Don't ignore the waiver wire. There could be something out there that could help you win or win a trade. So, just looking at what we have on the sheet, there's some other options here. What are some other common mistakes that Dynasty players make? I think what we had, don't ignore the waiver wire, don't give up too early is really important. And of course, don't trade away your first round pick. And I think the example that Chev gave was good for a guy like Derrick Henry, who's going to be on the later part of his career. We don't know what's going to happen. He's been banged up here and there too. Nate, let's start with you. What's another mistake that you want to make sure that you don't make?
We talk about neglecting depth sometimes because everyone's so excited to set that lineup. Everyone wants to have the top lineup, but there's bye weeks, there's injuries, there's just weird things happen. Like all of a sudden your wide receiver who you're really excited about in the offseason gets into the season and all of a sudden is sitting on the bench, or he's only playing in certain formations or something like that. And you got to pivot. And if you don't have depth in your wide receiver room, in your running back room, across the board, you're going to struggle right away. And then you're going to have to make moves in the season when you're pressured, when you can't think about them as long. You can't, sit on them, really think about it. You got to make quicker moves, which leads to more mistakes. So, if you don't have depth going into the season, you're already setting yourself up for failure. So if you don't have depth going into the season, you need to address that right away. And you can address that with lower draft capital and things like that. You got to make sure that if you're going to be a competitive team, that you have depth going into the season. You need to have 6 wide receivers you feel comfortable starting, 7 wide receivers, depending on how many you set in your lineup. You need to have 3 or 4 running backs, 2 quarterbacks if you're in 1 quarterback, 3 hopefully if you're in super flex, and 2 or 3 tight ends, depending on who your top tight end is. That's a lot of players. It's hard to be one of the top teams in the league. So if you're not one of the top teams in the league, you need to have as much depth as possible.
Chev, what about you?
I honestly think if you're starting a dynasty, you have to realize what the value of these picks are. I think so many times I see people just trading picks away like they just don't understand what those picks could turn out to be or what their teams are. because they played redraft and they just have not realized it. I think asking around, asking people kind of what the value of picks are, asking people about trades, I think you have to do that once you're starting off in Dynasty. And I think also just not trading all your main or trading for a one massive player and getting rid of so many assets. I've made that mistake before. I've done it plenty of times. Hopefully I can learn this upcoming year not to do that because the player is popping off. Like I told you guys earlier, don't trade for those guys right away. Save some of your assets, save some of your up-and-coming guys that you know have a chance to become maybe the same player as the player you're trading for right then. So that's the things that I have learned myself, and just learning strategies. Pay attention to what people do in your other leagues. Use that against some of your other league mates. I think just learning from your mistakes and learning from other people's mistakes in your leagues is a big key to becoming a better Dynasty fantasy football player, even fantasy football player, in my opinion.
Yeah, and for me, I'm going to close it out. Don't ignore your roster and lineup flexibility either. Yeah, it's really important. Like, you've all been in a startup draft, and there's some dude like, why is everybody taking tight ends? It was tight end premium. Like, if I get invited to a league, I either ask the person, what's the scoring setup, or if I just like that person and I agree, I'll go in and I'll check everything out myself. So it's really important because that obviously helps you build your roster correctly, helps you draft correctly, and helps you trade correctly too. Like, in one format, we'll use Derrick Henry as an example. He might be more valuable than another. He might be more valuable in standard scoring than he is in PPR formats. And what I like to do too is, I like to set my lineup and then look like, all right, where's my holes on my bench? Where can I do better? Try to get some nice value trades going on there, because everyone loves value, especially me.
Of course. We love value around here. We don't hate players. We hate values.